Hi, I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to a very special edition of the 50 Faces podcast. Our podcast is committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. I'm delighted to be joined here by Robert Morier, and he's the host of the Dakota podcast. I have featured on his podcast before, and he's been running this podcast for 3 years and is now at episode 140. Welcome, Robert. Thank you for coming here for this exploratory discussion.
Thanks, Ethan. It's so nice to be on your podcast. I've been listening very attentively over the last several years. I think you do incredible work. It was a pleasure to have you on our podcast at Dakota, but now to have this discussion about, where this is all, gone to is really exciting. So thanks for inviting me.
Fantastic. Well, I invited you as part of a reflection opportunity because I passed the 4 year mark. You're at the 3 year mark. We're about to release episode 300. And we have similar formats, I think, in that we have an interview format and we explore many of the same areas, such as financial literacy, careers in finance, how they've evolved. We do look at diversity. We've both had very diverse slates of guests. And we've both grown, I think, and really maximized the use of podcasting as a medium. So those are just some of the topics that I asked you to come here to discuss with me. So I'm going to pass it over to you and we'll do some back and forth, and hopefully this will be a nice discussion here.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Well, as you said, I'm the host of the Dakota Live podcast, and the Dakota Live podcast helps asset managers, asset allocators, and investors, whether they're students or educators, better understand the investment sales ecosystem so they can essentially fundraise more effectively. So it's a little bit more targeted in terms of how we think about the guests who come on, who are almost exclusively allocators. And as you said, it's been about 3 years. If you would have asked me 3 years and 1 month ago if I was going to be a podcast host, I would have thought that you were crazy and there's no way that this would have ever happened. But I think it's a testament to how quickly our industry has caught up to a lot of other industries who have been employing this type of a digital marketing medium for several years now. So yeah, so for me, it's been a great ride. I was curious. The first question that I had for you is what have you learned? You're twice as old as me as it relates to this podcast. So what are some of the lessons that you've taken as you think about this celebration of your fourth anniversary?
Well, thank you. And yes, thank you for qualifying that age thing in terms of relation to the podcast, in terms of number of what we've issued. So I think we had a slightly different target. We didn't focus necessarily on the sales medium, although naturally getting to know allocators is a great way for salespeople. I think anyone should get to know somebody in their backstory. For me, it was a desire to amplify stories, to have stories that I thought should have been told. And what I learned very much is how much I enjoyed collecting those stories. And that the whole medium of listening and listening more than you speak, which is something we don't always do, is incredibly enriching. And not only is it enriching, it's very rare, in fact, that somebody has a 40-minute session with someone where they're really inquiring about their drivers, their backstory. I'm really genuinely interested in that. I've used the expression attention is the most sincere form of generosity. And I do think that that has been perceived as a generous gesture. And as a result, I have got back every bit that I've put into it in terms of getting back a very, I think, authentic and open set of stories from people. And I never forget a single podcast. I'm sure you're the same.
I wish my memory was as strong as yours. I have forgotten conversations. Sometimes a listener will remind me of something that someone else said. So I try to make it a discipline to go back and listen to some of the episodes or see some of the clips, just because there's so much value, as you said, in listening. It is an underappreciated art form, particularly in our business. We're so trained to deliver a presentation, to deliver a process, to deliver a solution, that I think, often forget that the solution needs to fit into a model, an allocation model, or a total portfolio approach, whatever it is. And it's funny, we set out initially to talk to salespeople. Essentially, that's what I did. So I was working in business development, institutional sales for over 20 years. So I initially, wanted to help salespeople. It's a grind. I was, exhausted from, being on flights and going from city to city, country to country. So I wanted to create something that was helpful to salespeople, what happened really quickly, which is I just think what's interesting about this medium, is you start out thinking it's going to be one thing, and then it quickly grows into something much bigger. So what started out as really as a podcast for asset managers very quickly became a podcast for asset managers and asset allocators. So I started hearing more and more from the allocators who were learning from their peers. And then what I'm most proud of is that it became a tool for students and educators. The podcast gets used in classrooms, gets used in my classroom, obviously. It's a requirement to listen to some of these, but it also gets used in classrooms all over the country. So it's been fun to watch it, develop and grow. But it still is all about listening and the art of listening and, trying to find that nuance in what somebody says. And from a business development perspective, from a sales perspective, it's capturing that nugget of information and then seeing if it can, introduce something more, maybe an introduction to your strategy, a portfolio manager, or just a conversation.
It's so true. I think I'll have to use that device to boost my downloads, make it required listening. But I think it's interesting. Again, I think you probably your podcast do contain the hard skills and the soft skills, and clearly maybe it's the hard skills that are why students sign up, but it's the soft skills that are kind of that added bonus. And what I wanted to capture a little bit was that soft skill of survival sometimes in what is a volatile and at times hostile industry. Equally, these techniques that I thought were the most compelling to me. I'm sure you're this way, but I was not an expert in the audio medium. But very quickly, you start to capture those nuggets that are this is gold. You just know that what I define as gold is something that I haven't heard before in terms of a way of expressing something, a personal anecdote, and just fresh information. And that is my energy source now, is fresh information. Because you and
Mhm.
I have been on the circuit for years, and we know what canned information, what sales pitch sounds like. And I think to be in a setting where you are actually not being sold to is an incredibly refreshing and safe space to be. And then you also hear these nuggets of wisdom which have not been perfectly sound bited or basically delivered and mastered in a way for media. But that's the rawness and the authenticity that I love.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I joke around because I was in sales for so long that the best thing about the podcast is I never have to ask anyone for money. So I can just talk to them, ask them questions about who they are. And, I think when that wall is taken down, it introduces, as we'll say a lot, I'm sure today over the next 30 minutes, this level of authenticity around how that person, achieved that seat, whether they have 10 years of experience or 30 years of experience. And more often than not, it's a very non-traditional path. And I really wanted to emphasize that in the podcast that diversity comes in so many shapes and sizes. And one of them is your journey. There are diverse journeys. I was a history major. I was studying Asia and Africa and thinking that I was going to be living overseas and teaching. And I ended up a teacher, but it took 23 years to get here. I never thought that this would be the route that I'd be on. Where others that we've both interviewed, have had more of the formulaic path. But I do think that that's the rare path these days. The more traditional path is actually the non-traditional route. So I love highlighting those stories. So when you hear something really unique and different, to your point, it just gets you so excited and you're like, oh my goodness, I never knew that that's why this person entered the industry because they needed better health insurance for their children, or they didn't want to be farmers. Their family were farmers and they wanted to get off the farm and they were trying to figure out a way to do that. So all of these stories are just, really just wonderful. So
Exactly. And I think they tend to be positive too. That's the other thing. We do say that news is full of doom and gloom and that good news doesn't sell. I find in a setting like a podcast, and I have never come across a guest that is going to gripe from start to finish. I tend, because you're speaking about things that are of interest to them, what ignites their passion, I find that there is a lot of positivity and just effusive energy that comes from the podcast. And that is contagious. I think it's hard not to smile when you're listening. I usually do my recordings audio only because I actually like to experience hearing it as a podcast listener would hear it without hand gestures, without eyes communicating a message. Just I actually sometimes close my eyes and listen because that's how I want the things to wash over me. I want the tone of voice to matter. I want the expressions to matter and everything to be in that audio piece. So
yeah.
to their own. But to me, it's the enthusiasm and just the sheer excitement about our industry that comes through. I think that's a good way because, like yourself, education and encouraging of a pipeline into the industry was one of the overarching goals. I don't know whether my audience has attracted the same level of, say, student interest as yours. And that surprised me. What has surprised me a little has been the audience of peers that have listened
Mhm.
to this. I think we find certainly that somebody's immediate circles will listen, but it has very much been a professional audience of peers that are
Mhm.
still learning. And we do say we're committed to lifelong learning, but where is the vehicle for delivering that often? And this is a way, I think, of getting some of that career advice for people well beyond the pipeline and the initial ascent. They're at that now, that holding pattern perhaps. So I think there's a lot of a need for education there too.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the other reason, maybe it's a little bit more subtle, but there is so much change going on in the industry that I think both allocators and asset managers want to hear from their peers. So they're prepared for it, whatever that may be. It could be the consolidation of two RIAs. It might be the consolidation of two consultants. It might be, a change at the federal level. It might be a change at the local level. But I think your podcast in particular has done a very good job of keeping track of change, and a lot of it comes through people's personal stories. As it relates to the medium, truth be told, the only reason we're video is we have this beautiful studio and we want to, utilize it. But when I first started podcasting, I recognized pretty quickly that if I wanted to have anybody under 25 years old watch the podcast. Most of them are digesting it via video these days. And YouTube in particular, it's funny, we're, of the same age range. So, for you growing up in the UK and Ireland, it's the BBC and beyond. For me, it was ABC, NBC, CBS. That was it. YouTube as a channel was not anything I would have ever thought was possible. But I do agree, though. I think when it's all said and done, it is the audio that people really hear. It's our voices and, hoping that we're going to ask them the question that's on their mind. Because, whether you're an 18-year-old student sitting in a classroom like here at Drexel University, or you're, a 48-year-old investment professional wanting to ask that question of that asset manager, sometimes you just need a little bit of help. And I think you in particular have done a very good job at asking those questions. I do have a question for you, and I've been thinking about it a lot, just knowing your podcast really well. And you had mentioned diversity, and I don't mean this question to sound provocative, but it feels like, given just the climate today, it is. Are you a diversity podcast?
I'd say certainly it's in our name. I'd say what we are is affirmative representation as opposed to any form of affirmative action. And it was always intended to be basically a reflection of the society we live in through the lens of our industry. So having just as much a mix of 50-50 women versus women and men, many different faces on that podcast that reflect our society, not our industry. So that was always the origins. At one point, we used diversity a bit more front and center in terms of our maybe our mission. And we ask that question still, even of every guest, not just guests that might see themselves as in a minority, what you think of the diversity in the industry. Increasingly, they give an answer, like you mentioned, around socioeconomic mobility, cognitive diversity, all of these things really mattering. And I think what we've always done is we don't believe in affirmative action. What we believe is the piece we are solving for is providing that representation so that we create a library of role models so that when we are trying to attract people into our industry or encourage people to stay in it, we can have them look through Spotify. I encourage them to look at the Spotify list because that has all the portraits of everybody who's been featured, all 300 plus. And they can glance down that and they can see people that pique their interest because they maybe look like them, came from the same place they came from, and then they have a role model right there. So I think it's the lack of role models. People always speak to this, that they have not had a mentor or anybody that was as they could identify with throughout their career. And this is my attempt to bring that to a broader audience. Because I think one thing that has struck me is that our experience, our zone of experience is so narrow ever that we can never possibly have all the experiences that we perhaps need to have to make us resilient, make us ready to face the next challenge or the next market downturn. But if we listen to how others coped with analogous situations, that I think will enable us to be somehow fortified. And this all came out of the idea of family narratives, that families who told stories of previous generations succeeding and overcoming hardship are more resilient families. And we don't have multi-generational families living together in the same way. We don't have the same oral tradition. So I think that's missing. And even with hybrid working, we're not all together anymore. So if we can share our stories, my idea is we share resilience and we have this affirmative representation and resilience. That's what I mean by diversity.
I love that. I love the idea of a library of role models. That's a great way to put it. It's interesting. We didn't, the Dakota Live podcast, we didn't set out to be a diversity podcast either. We didn't use it in our descriptions or the way that we talked about topics with our guests. And that wasn't by design. It was just that we wanted to, again, target a very specific need in the industry at the time that we launched. But something that was important to me was making sure that we had a diverse representation of guests. So I had the same kind of target in my mind. I wanted to make it 50-50, if not more, of women and minorities who were guests on the show, primarily because that's who I had worked with. So that's what I knew. I started at a European asset manager that was very diverse. I went on, to work at Goldman Sachs, which was a very large, diverse organization. When I moved back to Philadelphia, I was working for a women and minority-owned business, a multi-manager business called Expedence, which was founded by Tina Biles Williams. So it's kind of all I knew. So I was just bringing in who I knew. What I felt was actually missing, maybe because I was so close to it, I felt like I had this, really diverse kind of table around me of people. But one thing that was always concerning to me a little bit was that there wasn't a lot of age diversity. We had a lot of people with like kind of 15, 20, 25 years or more who we would hear on these podcasts, and not so much yours, but certainly some of the other ones. And I felt like there was a lot of value added in speaking with people who were, less than 10 years of experience, because I don't know what it's like to not, to grow up only with a smartphone. I don't know what it's like to grow up in an environment where, remote work was always a thing, and I wanted to get that perspective, particularly from a manager research perspective. And that has been very helpful. So I think for me, that was the first thing. And then after that, it was just making sure, to your point, that that cachet of faces always, looked like anybody, who would dial in. You can find somebody who has a similar story to you or a similar challenge that, that you're facing, that they're facing. So I think it does beg the question, though, which I'd love to hear from you, is like, what do you think this evolution is going to look like over the next, let's just say, we'll say 1 to 4 years, where, you have a lot of, there's a lot of rhetoric and there's a lot of political action. And to a certain extent, there's a lot of legal action going on, that's changing not only the way that we see things, but the way that we speak about things, the words that we use, which has changed very quickly, even since I launched this podcast.
Yeah, fascinating insights. And I think just to reflect on some things you said, when you said age diversity, I immediately thought of at the older age of the spectrum. And that's because that's something that actually suffers in the workplace. So I've gone into every pocket that I felt there was discrimination in. I think you're speaking about some of the younger age of the spectrum, hearing their views. And I will admit that that is a difficult cohort to attract onto a podcast, because I think there's a sense like, well, I haven't done anything yet, or my story isn't done yet. I have nothing to say. I have nothing to show for it. And I get that from people across the spectrum, never mind their age. And usually my answer to that is, well, I'll be the judge of that as to whether you have a good story or not, because I can find that almost everyone has a good story. But I think also we had this idea of, the Heraclitus statement that a man never steps in the same river twice, because it is not the same river and it is not the same man. We are all evolving throughout our careers, and we are experiencing, maybe the same situation as a different person with more wisdom, or a different situation with the learning that we bring from that. So no matter what the snapshot is, I want to hear from you. And I look back at my own career, and I said some pretty insightful things, age 21, I think. I wasn't an idiot. The wisdom I have now, I had probably a lot less I suppose, of the lessons of life. But I do think that's really key. As far as where is this all going, I think one thing we are starting to, the trap we're falling into is this baby being thrown out with the bathwater when it comes to DEI, and the sense that it is incompatible with a meritocratic system, as if it was a meritocratic system before. I think what we have
Mhm.
exposed through our stories is it was not a meritocratic system before. The networks that prevailed before, whether you go to the same school or you drank in the same bar or you remember the same country club, those were the factors that bind. And one theme that has come through over and over again from my very first podcast was the importance of network. That is something that nobody teaches you. If you should teach it in your class, if you don't, because that is absolutely critical, is the network you build. And these networks define the old work order. It was not a meritocracy then. There's a sense that we're going back to the merit. No, we're not. We don't want to go back to that being that network, this sort of the Gilded Age of networks that simply don't even exist today. So we have to rebuild, and where we need to rebuild is earning it and showing results. So what I'm trying to do is not only cut through some of these old network, I suppose the frozen in time, these network the arteries, say to speak, in terms of how business got done, by busting through them, by trying to first of all force people into or encourage people to make more connections, but equally try to show great people doing great work who happen to be diverse. I don't bring
Yeah.
someone on the pod. There's no such thing as a diversity hire on the 50 Faces podcast. I don't bring somebody on because they have a certain look. I bring somebody on because I've been impressed by what they do and I want to hear their story. If they have a certain look, that just adds to the mix we have. So that's, I think, how we will go with diversity is we have to keep showing up and using as role models people who just do good work, but we
Mhm.
will not have enough people doing good work if they're not shown the path. And the path is through networking, through role models, mentorship, and basically having an open opportunity set.
Yeah, yeah, that's all wonderful insights. I'm glad you brought up networking. It just had me thinking. I'm lucky in a sense. I teach venture capital. I teach early stage, specifically early stage venture capital. So for anyone who's not watching this podcast, I'm sitting in Drexel University's venture capital incubator. So we incubate companies all around me. So there are 30 startups that are just kind of surrounding me right now, coming up with ideas or executing, on business plans. And in venture, in particular, in early stage, just private markets, it's so important to understand your network and who is working with you, helping you work, assisting you on this journey. So in some ways, it's made it a little easier, have a tailwind of networking because in venture in particular, it's so referral based and and it's also very like kind of geographically oriented. So you have to know certain markets very well. And I've been grateful that we kind of teach that in the classroom through this experiential learning, mostly through guests. Though I do say often, and I ask this question often, the guests who come on always stress networking. It's the most important thing. Most of the time, they'll stress networking is the most important thing a college age student can be doing in order to help their careers. But it's really hard. And I hear that time and again from younger people that it's not as easy as you think. And those modes of transportation that we have had historically are very different. It's digital, so it looks like it's easier, just like it looks like I have a lot of friends on Facebook, but in the reality, I'm a home alone, typing on my computer. It's kind of the same thing with networking. So I think one thing we really try to encourage, at least in the classroom, is getting out, getting out away from your computer, taking your earbuds out of your ears, actually engaging with somebody who's standing next to you in line at Starbucks, or taking your headphones off at the gym, or talking to the person who's sitting next to you on the flight, because you never know where those conversations are going to go. And I have a real life example. I was sitting on a flight with my oldest daughter, Margot, and I'm by myself with my daughter, so I think I have it bad. This is tough. I'm trying to get my kids, and that was only at one of them. And then I look to my left, and there's a person sitting directly next to me, and she has three children next to her, and one of those children had a disability. And so I'm immediately level set that, okay, I'm going to be fine. This incredible person is getting it done. And I said something to her. I said, I just want to say I'm impressed. It's amazing that you're doing all this. And that conversation is now her as my co-professor, teaching a class called Funding for Impact, where we look at venture capital principles for nonprofits, how to measure outcomes. Her name is Dr. Danielle Barber. She's at the University of Colorado. She teaches at Colorado Children's Hospital. She was here at Children's Hospital Philadelphia. And we're going to use the foundation that she's very much a part of because of her daughter in the classroom. And that's because I sat next to her on a flight. And that's the kind of thing that I really try to stress with students, that the networking opportunities, the LinkedIn is helpful. It flattens it, or the classroom and a guest speaker, it's helpful. It flattens it. But it's up to you, to have that courage and that confidence as best you can muster. Fake it if you need to, but as best you can, and ask how somebody's doing. That's all I did. I just asked Dr. Barber how she's doing. And we were both tired, and she was really tired because she was also moving to Denver. But I think those are wonderful insights, Ethan. I think particularly the power of networking and the strength of relationships. So thanks for sharing that. It reminded me of all that.
Yeah, I also, the only time I'd say yes, keep your headphones in is when you're listening to a podcast, because of course then you get some great insights. But I've learned a lot. I listened to one of my favorite podcasts is Pivot with Scott Galloway and Kara Swisher,
Mhm.
and that he talks on that podcast about a little bit about the value of money and the things that really have value in life. And one of the things he says is a compliment, well placed and sincerely meant, can actually be the most valuable gift you can give somebody. And I will say that type of thing, when it comes to networking, I think you start with giving either of compliments, obviously sincere ones, and also giving of your time and your effort and just helping others. If that's how you start, networking will not be difficult. And I think it will come more naturally. And I will say that one of the issues I also think is with connections and promotions, etc., is we do have this problem of mirror neurons. The problem being that we have this manosphere podcast now, where we have a lot of young male hosts, listeners, audience, and there's a mirror neuron effect. I think these are the new role models. I don't know that we can ever fully break that, but I think what we can do is showcase interesting perspectives that go well beyond someone's identity, that move away from identity politics and have a more of a kind of a cognitive alliances perhaps that are built around, because that I think is how we will break the mirror neuron problem. I will say that when it comes to compliments, I do a lot of media. I get a lot more compliments from men who completely reach out to
Mhm.
me on LinkedIn and have that gesture. And I think
Mhm.
that support, that kind of proactive support, is something that maybe we all need to think about doing more.
Yeah, that's a great point and really interesting. Well, if you start talking about conspiracy theories, I'll be worried, Ethan. I hope you don't start going down that podcast route. That seems to garner some listeners, but I don't know if that's the kind of show either of us want to create. So I like that podcast quite a bit as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Well, I know we only have so much time, and I'm also really wanting to hear your thoughts about the future and trends and what topics you're going to cover in the year ahead, and and how you see our industry that we talk about often, asset management, changing over the next few years.
Great question. And I just about to wrap my first series this year, and there's been a lot of sustainable finance and ESG topics in there. A lot of net zero, nature-based investing, and this comes at a time of tremendous headwinds around the strategies. Many asset managers deselecting from membership of these net zero alliances, the voluntary organization dropping ESG. So it came at a very interesting time, because we obviously asked this question of all of the guests, but I have a particularly concentrated cluster. So clearly that's where there's still a lot of action. And I think but the opportunity to ask these guests who have been passionate around sustainable finance, what they say about the headwinds, whether there's been the laziness and labeling, whether it's just got too sloppy on that side, and whether we got kind of too big for our britches. I think that has been a great and a way of really kind of trimming it to size. And I'm hoping that also enables us to get out of the polarization that we're in, because politics is one thing, and we can't single-handedly fix that, certainly between us, but we can at least bring the conversation around investment out of those polls. Because if we try to bring it to the corporate reality, try to knit together a unity and a common purpose in some of these investments, I think we will get more listeners tuning in and not tuning out when they hear a certain label. So maybe that means we have to drop labels. The other thing I think we need much more challenges around governance. And that has been something that really troubles me for some time. I think this is something that's not getting better, it's getting worse. The ability to challenge the use of hybrid board meetings and the increased complexity of things from sustainable finance to digital assets to some of the more I say complex instruments that are still being devised. It is forcing people, and attention spans are shorter. We know that people are not, apart from the people who listen to a 3 hour Joe Rogan, most people would prefer to have small sound bites. So we don't have the time to digest long piece of information, which means that there is a desire for less engagement, less robust debate. I like to create these salons, and I'm looking forward to a podcast we're going to do in the next week or so, where we have a nice debate of ideas, because I think that debating ideas in a respectful setting is a way to again get out of the polls and into the middle, and actually get into a real substantive debate that is not going to be about name calling and identity. Because that to me, if we translate that to governance, I think we have to train all of us to work with conflict. We're in a world of conflict. Work with conflict and achieve something. We may achieve maybe a compromise from our own ideals. But when I say achieve, is we can get decisions made that are not box ticking at a governance level. You and I are both probably at levels where we do sit on boards, or we're asked to be on boards. And I think that's a very, I think, a perilous place right now, governance.
I agree. It's always a good question. I'm always interested to hear our guests' views on governance. It's not typically, it's not the sexiest question, but it's probably the most important. Particularly with some of these pension funds that we've both spoken to, over the years. So yeah, and I do love the idea of the salon, the idea of these small groups of, not just strategic thinkers, but critical thinkers. Whether they're asset managers, asset owners, or, thought leaders. And I also think it's important for us, at least it's been important for me, is also this idea of geographic diversity, particularly in the United States, because we're so polarized. We're polarized on the coasts, we're polarized between the Southeast and the Northeast. So I really, I don't think I did it by design at first. I think I missed traveling at first. I had kind of stopped traveling effectively after, 2 decades of doing nothing but traveling. So I missed it at first, but when I was, in North Dakota, or I was, even in the Pacific Northwest, you started hearing the cultural nuances of the region. You started hearing the difference in what people's needs were, and where the expectations may lie as it relates to, investment objectives and goals, which I do think is a leading indicator of kind of what's going on more broadly, in a community. So we started taking the show on the road, effectively, and having these smaller conversations. And to me, that's been I think the most rewarding thing as it relates to, not just the personal side, but also kind of where I see this going. I think having those more kind of, it's not just people thinking exactly the same about the same things. We're all reading the same paper, and we're all digesting the same articles. It's having some debate, because things are different where we live. And my family is indicative of that. I grew up in New Jersey. I have a family that live in New England. I have family that live in the Mississippi Delta. And for me, it's very different between Thanksgiving and Christmas in terms of what we're talking about. If I'm in Maine in Thanksgiving, and in Greenwood, Mississippi in over Christmas, there's different viewpoints, and I think I wanted to capture that as well. So I hope going forward, the industry catches on to that, and it catches on, to what you're doing on the podcast with 50 Faces, because it's more, I think of 50 faces, but I just think it's 50 opinions. And then you can kind of aggregate them, and then you take them and you say, okay, we're not going to solve this today, but this is what's interesting about your opinion. This is what's interesting about my opinion, and where can we meet? And that's how solutions are created, in my opinion. So I hope there's more of that as we go forward. You're doing a great job, though, Eva.
I love that, and thank you. But also, just to conclude, I think you mentioned critical thinking is a great one, because that is the one thing I think, first of all, we all need to do more of with AI generated content. And equally, maybe that's the only thing we will be good for, again, is thinking
Yes.
synthesizing ideas which are in a fresh and original way. I think originality is going to still hopefully be the vestige of the human being, the human thinker,
I couldn't,
and original critical thinking. And I
I
know,
couldn't agree more.
yeah, so I'm hoping that the more we do of that, and again, respectful debate, but not being afraid to challenge and to ask why or what if we're wrong. So well, thank you so much, Robert. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I can't wait to collaborate more. I'm looking forward to our debate next week. And thank you for indulging me in this reflection.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Congratulations on all your success, Ethan. I really appreciate being a part of your show. I'm honored to ask you, and we'll use some of this for my show as well, because it's just great to talk with you. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Ethan Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.